Hey there! It's been a while since the last book recommendations video, so here's another. Today we'll be discussing works that will give us more insight as to how the largest and longest lasting socialist experiment of the previous century functioned, economically, politically, and more. Differing from previous recommendations, all these works can be found for free online, either on archive.com or libgen. Searching the title with PDF on Google will yield many results, so there's nothing to worry about. Of course, I'll timestamp this, so if you want to jump to a particular book, then just take a look at the pinned comment. If you'd like more book recommendations, there are a few more on my channel that I've put in a playlist for ease of access. Let's get started. The first work is Alec Nove's An Economic History of the USSR. This work is an absolutely beautiful summary of Soviet economic development and history. What was done, how, to what extent, what institute was started, who led it, the motivations of differing policies, and on and on. The book breaks down Soviet economic history into periods, for example, the Khrushchev period, the Brezhnev period, etc., with the bulk of the book focusing on the early to middle periods of Soviet economic development. Interestingly, the author doesn't skip over what would be considered breaks in a nation's economy, covering the policy of war communism, Soviet production during World War II, and more. The final chapter, discussing Gorbachev-era reforms and just the general mess that existed, is especially enlightening. The author is somewhat of a market socialist, though. You can see this from his other works, which, being fair, are also pretty decent. But I think that slightly colors a few of his criticisms. Nonetheless, it is a beautifully professional and nuanced work that provides a different and all too neglected view of Soviet socialism. The next work is Albert Szymanski's Human Rights in the Soviet Union. Szymanski is an excellent writer, and every book he's written is worth its weight in gold. Honestly, I'd recommend you read all of his works. In this particular book, however, Szymanski goes over all the usual claims about the Soviet Union, either dispelling them or providing necessary context and comparing them to their American counterpart. As you may expect, the world exists in a certain set of conditions, and the USSR was no different. Szymanski expertly goes over these issues with the nuance they deserve, and presents an image not of some horrific sci-fi dystopia, nor some socialist workers' paradise where the clouds rain milk and honey. It's an honest and human portrayal of the USSR, going over economic and cultural development of the various nationalities within the USSR, the rights and living standards of women, the economic rights that the Soviet people enjoyed, and much more. Very interestingly, the final few chapters deal with the repression that existed within the USSR, and Szymanski goes over them in a very mature and fact-based manner. Unlike what you may imagine, the book isn't an attempt to paint the USSR in a quote-unquote better light. Its real intent is to show the USSR as it was. Everything from healthcare to unions to psychological ward internment of certain dissidents is covered. Honestly, read it. The third work is also by our good friend Szymanski, titled Is the Red Flag Still Flying? This could be considered more for the economically inclined, but I definitely think everybody should read this work. In it, Szymanski discusses the underlying nature of the USSR, the political processes that lead to economic and other policies, the place of market forces, trade relations and relations with other socialist countries, class considerations and structure, and more. Like many nuanced works on former socialist experiments, many who have never touched Szymanski's works have suddenly made up their minds about it. I think it's clear that this is a childish and un-Marxist behavior. This work and many others are still very critical of the mistakes of the USSR and call them out when they see them. To note, the purpose of reading these works is so that we can, 1, be educated in what previous attempts at socialism tried, and 2, apply the things they did correctly, build up on the things that needed more work, and reject the things that were outright wrong. Information to socialism is like the sun to a bud. Without it, it'll stagnate and wither. Next book is Pat Sloan's Soviet Democracy. It's an older work, but it's still very useful. Essentially, this is an exploration of the Soviet system through foreign eyes. An American, going to work as a teacher within the USSR, got to experience Soviet life in its fullest. Unlike in other countries, a foreigner within the USSR could participate in democracy if they worked. Your nationality had no bearing on your ability to participate in the Soviet system. Within the book, trade union life, your rights as a worker, the election process, and much more is discussed from the intimate perspective of a foreigner that nonetheless participated in these tasks. It's an excellent primer on the USSR, in my opinion. Someone who published it online, too, if you want to get a physical copy. Next up is the industrialization of Soviet Russia. I'll touch on this very briefly, as so few of you will actually go out and read these probably. This is a massive multi-volume work detailing the industrialization of the USSR from the late 20s up until the late 30s, with each volume focusing on year periods, for example, 1931 to 1933. It covers collectivization, the measures of industrialization, the effects of ramping up production for World War II, and on. Very impressive and highly academic work. If anything, can be used as a reference work, really. If you're very interested in the nitty-gritty of the agricultural and industrial base development of the USSR, then look no further. The next work is Webb's Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. Before I start, this work has a few versions. There is the around 1,000 page original, with 2 versions present, a 1,062 page single transcribed PDF, and another version split into 2 volumes, a 300 page abridged version, and a 30-something page pamphlet. I'm discussing the original massive work. This really was a labor of love. If you want a single book to have as an overview of everything Soviet, this is the place to look. I can't begin to mention how much this book covers. The only way to do it justice is to put the contents page on the screen for yourself to see, so pause on whatever you'd like to read. If you'd rather read one large book instead of 6 smaller books, this is the best choice. And note, though, I believe the person that transcribed this work originally did it through an OCR, so sometimes certain words are misspelled, with the I in the word inefficient, for example, being an exclamation mark. It doesn't really affect the text much, however. The next work is Socialism in the Soviet Union by Jonathan Arthur. This is a later work than the previous 2, and that's evidence as it discusses, amongst other things, the Khrushchev and Brezhnev reforms. This is a no-nonsense work in which the author covers the controversial, quote-unquote controversial, questions concerning the USSR, namely the aforementioned reforms, the supposed, and sometimes real, productivity problem of the late USSR, the supposed existence of commodity production and wage labor, the question of the Soviet Union's export of finance capital, the nature of governance, and more. A very interesting work with a perspective we don't really see much. The sort of work everyone should read to get a nuanced view of the late USSR, in my opinion. The next work is The Soviet Form of Popular Government by the USSR Academy of Sciences. There's been a lot of talk from people outside the USSR. How about we hear what the Soviets themselves had to say? This book discusses everything there is you'd like to know about the Soviets within the USSR. It discusses local governments, the Soviets of autonomous SSRs, all the way up to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. How they work, what interconnects with what, systems of review, delegations, issues of every possible stripe, medical, agricultural, and on. Not only this, but information on their development throughout the years, as well as their formation in the first place, is discussed. Many things are gone over in excruciating detail. I'm not gonna lie, this is one of the more boring works on the list. It's a detailed academic description of the systems of Soviets at all levels, with examples of even the most tedious things. It's an important thing to read, though, but in a technical reference work sort of way. At least it isn't too long, at 250-something pages. The next work is Mick Costello's Workers' Participation in the Soviet Union. A fantastic, short work on the differing forms of worker participation within the USSR and the Soviet system. Trade unions, production committees, enterprise-level management, and more is discussed within the book. The work also has comparisons with British trade unions of the previous century, but I doubt that's of much use to most people. It wasn't for me. Regardless, a fantastic work. This is perfect for dispelling the usual Soviet workers had no say nonsense you hear from the right, and ironically from left comms as well. The shortest work on the list so far, I definitely recommend you plow through this in an afternoon or something. Alright, the last 2 works, I'll lightning round them since they're interesting, but I'm doubtful many will look into them, and this video is getting long enough. The 2 works are The Great Conspiracy Against Russia by Kahn and Sayers, and The Soviets and Ourselves, 2 Commonwealths by Holm. The first work is just a great overview of Soviet history up to the war. Very little is skipped, and it's written in a narrative novel-like fashion, so it's quite an entertaining read too. Essentially a history book, but with focus on all the difficulties, both internal and external, that the early Soviet state had to face. The second work was recently redone by someone on Twitter in 2019, being transcribed into a PDF with some additions here and there. The text isn't all that interesting compared to the rest of the books recommended. What is interesting, however, is that the work came with these isotypes, comparing Soviet and British elections and government structures. It's rare to see these sort of things in a graphic fashion, so that's why I mentioned this work. Google them to see what I mean. And that's it. Like I said, you can find all of these online, either on LibGen, a quick Google search, or on the communism subreddit, if anything. Now, I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Patrick Mansouri, Felipe Corrales, Deep Teeth, Jenny Enox, Bibla Ridion Fan, Comrade R, Alexander Shendi, Wild Bill, Brandon Vergara, John Edward Carrion, A Comrade, At Southern Marxists, Close Sniper, Colin Moran, Because Butts, Bookbinder, Alex Benishek, Comrade Goat, D. Lang, Darius A. Birdall, James Kavanaugh, John Bernston, John Poland, Noel, Nobody, Paul Luders, Pauline McDeesey, Rocco, Rose Hogginson, Scott Radburn, Alan Plum, Andy Haywood, Brandon Persuade, Coach Cinnamon T, Comrade Benito, Comrade Pingu, Dale McFarlane, El Juanton, Eli Garzon, Eugene Simonovsky, Farah Tahan, Garlic Bread, Grammar Antifa, Granola Joe, Industrial Robot, Wes, Soviet Puma, Kong Zhao Hu, DV Gold Gamer, Jaden, Philostakis, Job, Eddie Luck, Spooky Scary Socialist, Jordan Follows, Khan, Kyle Rapp, Liam Sipanen, Libertarian Stalinist, Manda, Mass Strike Now, Matt, Mika Argopoulos, Michael Reddy Webster, Namratha Prabhu, Natalie Taylor, Omar Abdul-Jabbar, Parker Cushing, Renkel Blancaster, Ring, Rudy, Sid Singh, Sussy M, Ted Teddington Tedsville, Toki Mukai, Tristan Drian, Veral Dor, Zatarani, and of course Zarin Arsen. See you next time.